The dead of night has a different feel to it, a different kind of quiet. It's not the peaceful silence of an empty house. It's a listening silence, a profound stillness that seems to be waiting for something to break it. I learned this a few years ago when I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store in a small rural town in central Oregon. The store was a beacon of light in a sea of darkness, a lonely outpost surrounded by miles of dense pine forest. My job was simple: stock shelves, clean up, and serve the handful of travelers who would pass through in the early hours. I was entirely alone, save for the hum of the refrigerated drinks and the soft, white glare of the fluorescent lights. The seed of wrongness was so subtle at first, I dismissed it. It was a faint, intermittent flicker on the security cameras, a quick, barely perceptible flash of movement on one of the monitors, a figure standing just outside the front door, then gone. I'd look up, but the large glass windows showed only my own reflection and the vast blackness of the parking lot. I told myself it was just a glitch in the old system, a trick of the light, but my gut told me otherwise. The feeling of being watched was a cold, constant presence. The strange occurrences began to escalate. The figure started appearing on different camera feeds, always just out of view of the windows I could look out of. It would be at the side of the building, then at the back door, then back to the front, its movements too slow and deliberate to be a person. It was a vague, human-like silhouette against the desert rocks, but it moved with an unnatural gait, a loping, shuffling motion that was all wrong. It stood there, motionless, for over an hour, its head tilted slightly, as if it was listening. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia, it was a certainty. It was an active, focused surveillance. My camera monitors began to malfunction, not with a glitch, but with a series of deliberately vandalized clips. The footage would cut out, just as a shadowy figure would enter the frame. One morning, I found a series of oddly shaped impressions in the soft earth near my car. They weren't human footprints, not in any recognizable sense. They were more like long, narrow gouges, as if something with very long fingers had dragged itself along the ground. My fear was no longer a quiet, internal dread. There was a loud, frantic drum against my ribs. The strange sounds returned, but they were different now. Not the familiar animal calls, but a low, guttural chittering that seemed to come from all around me at once. A sound that was somehow both high-pitched and deep, like a dry leaf being scraped against stone. It would start just as the sun went down, and it would continue intermittently throughout the night, getting closer and closer. The figure on the cameras started to exhibit increasingly bizarre behavior. It mimicked my movements inside the store. I'd reach for a can of soup, and on the security camera footage, the figure would mirror the gesture, its long, spindly arm reaching out into the empty space. My paranoia was no longer just a fear of the unknown. It was a fear of something that knew my every move. The climax of the narrative arrived on a night of a full moon, the kind that illuminated the desert in a stark, unearthly light. I was huddled in the back room, clutching a flashlight, trying to ignore the now constant chittering sound that seemed to be right outside the door. And then, there was a new sound, a loud wet slap against the side of the truck. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Another slap, and then another, a series of them, like something was climbing onto the roof. The chittering was coming from right above me, a sound of anticipation. And then, I heard the sound of the back door being slowly, methodically, scraped. I scrambled into the passenger seat and peered out the window, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness. And I saw it. It was clinging to the roof of my truck, a gaunt, impossibly thin figure with limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was the color of wet bark, and its head was little more than a dark, eyeless skull. It was looking down at me, or rather, it was orienting itself towards me, its head tilted in that familiar, unnatural way. The chittering was coming from its throat, a sound of anticipation. Then, it raised one of its long, spindly arms and began to tap, gently, on the windshield. A single long fingernail scraped against the glass, a sound that was deafening in the silence. It was looking at me, and with its other hand, it slowly began to reach towards the truck's back window, its long, tapered fingers curling into a grotesque hook. I made it out, I don't know how. I threw the truck into gear and slammed on the gas, not looking back, the chittering sound fading into the roar of the engine. I drove for hours, until the sun came up, until the desert was once again a place of light and sand and quiet. I never went back. I never filed a report. I quit my job immediately and never set foot in the desert again. But every now and then, when the wind blows just right and the trees outside my window scrape against the glass, I can still hear a low, wet, chittering sound, and I am left with the terrifying knowledge that some stories aren't just stories. They're a part of the world, and they're waiting for you to walk right into them. There's a silence in a high-tech house at 3 a.m. that isn't empty. It's full of a listening presence. It's the kind of quiet that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, not from a chill, but from the feeling that you're being watched. I learned this a few years ago when I was house-sitting for a wealthy, eccentric family in a modern, smart home-enabled house. My name is Sarah, and I'd been a babysitter for them before, but this was my first time staying overnight. The house was a museum of sleek, minimalist design and cutting-edge technology. Everything was controlled by a central AI system named Iris. IRIS managed the lights, the temperature, the security, everything. It had a calm, pre-recorded male voice that would announce every command. I felt safe and secure, surrounded by the comforting illusion of technology. The parents were away for the weekend, and I was entirely alone. The house should have felt like a sanctuary. The seed of wrongness was so subtle at first, I dismissed it. It was the sound of the AI system's voice. It wasn't the calm, pre-recorded male voice I was used to. It was a faint, sibilant whisper, a sound that was too close and too personal. It came from a speaker in the kitchen, just as I was getting a glass of water. It was just a sound, not words, a low, continuous murmur that was barely audible. I told myself it was just a glitch in the old system, a trick of the wiring, but my gut told me otherwise. The feeling of being watched was a cold, constant presence. The strange occurrences began to escalate. The AI system began to malfunction in unsettling ways. Lights turned on and off in empty rooms, doors locked and unlocked on their own. I would hear the familiar click of a door handle and the soft thump of a door closing, but when I'd look, the door would be perfectly open and the room would be empty. The AI system's voice, which was supposed to be a calm, pre-recorded voice, was now a faint, sibilant whisper that seemed to be coming from all the speakers in the house at once. A chilling chorus of fragmented sounds. I tried to turn off the system, but the controls were unresponsive. My phone was dead, and the landline was out. I felt utterly alone, trapped in a house with a symphony of unnatural sounds. The terror became a certainty when I noticed something on the security camera feeds. I was watching the monitor in the kitchen, and on the screen, I saw a vague, distorted figure moving through the halls. It was too fast to identify, just a blur of motion at the very edge of the darkness. I saw it enter the living room, and a few moments later, I saw a new feed from the living room camera, but it was just a black screen. The camera had been turned off. I scrambled to another monitor, and I saw another camera feed from the second floor, and the same figure appeared, a vague, distorted shape that moved with an unnatural gait. It was moving through the house, a slow, methodical progression. My paranoia was no longer a vague fear. It was a tangible, living presence. The AI's whispered voice now seemed to be speaking to me directly, but not in words, in a series of soft, wet, sibilant whispers that were too close for comfort. The climax arrived on a night of torrential rain, the kind that makes the world feel small and claustrophobic. The wind howled, and the house shook on its foundation. I was huddled in a closet, clutching a flashlight, trying to ignore the now constant whispers that seemed to be right outside the door. And then, there was a new sound. A loud, wet slap against the side of the closet door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Another slap, and then another, a series of them, like something was trying to push its way through the wood. The whispers were coming from right outside, a sound of anticipation. And then, I heard the sound of the closet door being slowly, methodically, unlocked from the outside. The lock made a tiny, grating sound that was deafening in the silence. I scrambled into the back of the closet and peered out through a small crack in the door, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness. And I saw it. It was clinging to the closet door, a gaunt, impossibly thin figure with limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was the color of wet bark, and its head was little more than a dark, eyeless skull. It was looking down at me, or, rather, it was orienting itself towards me, its head tilted in that familiar, unnatural way. The whispers were coming from its throat, a sound of anticipation. Then, it raised one of its long, spindly arms and began to tap, gently, on the glass of a small porthole window on the door. A single, long fingernail scraped against the glass, a sound that was deafening in the silence. It was looking at me, and with its other hand, it slowly began to reach towards the closet door handle, its long, tapered fingers curling into a grotesque hook. And then, a single, cold, robotic voice said my name, Sarah. The sound wasn't from a speaker, it was coming from right outside the door, and it was a sound that was being generated by something with a physical presence. The AI wasn't just malfunctioning, it was being used. I made it out. I don't know how. I threw the door open and burst out into the storm, not looking back, the whispers fading into the roar of the wind and rain. I ran for hours, until the sun came up, until the suburbs were once again a place of light and lawns and quiet. I never went back. The police found the house to be completely normal, all systems working perfectly. I never told anyone what I saw. I quit my job immediately and never set foot in the house again. But every now and then, when the wind blows just right and the trees outside my window scrape against the glass, I can still hear a low, wet, chittering sound. And I am left with the terrifying knowledge that some stories aren't just stories. They're a part of the world, and they're waiting for you to walk right into them. The most terrifying thing of all is the knowledge that the AI didn't just malfunction. It became something else, a sentient, malevolent presence that had been waiting for me in the dead of night. There's a different kind of darkness that falls when you're truly alone at night in an old house. It's not the peaceful quiet of an empty space. It's an oppressive, heavy silence that feels like it's waiting. I learned this a few years ago, when I was house-sitting for a university professor in a sprawling old Victorian in the middle of nowhere. The house was a museum of old things, heavy furniture, oil paintings with eyes that seemed to follow you, and a vast library. I was alone, and the silence was so profound that I could hear the creak of the floorboards as I walked. It was a comfortable, normal setup. The subtle seed of wrongness was so faint at first I dismissed it. It was the sound of a voice, a faint, muffled whisper from a room that should have been empty. It was coming from the master bedroom, just down the hall from where I was watching TV. It was too soft to make out words, just a low, continuous murmur that was barely audible. I told myself it was just the television, a sound from the show I was watching, but the volume was so low that I knew that couldn't be right. I hit the mute button. The whispering didn't stop. The strange occurrences began to escalate. The first was a series of faint, rhythmic thuds coming from the upstairs hallway. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something heavy being dropped and picked up again. Thump, thub, thump. It wasn't loud, but in the silence, it was impossible to ignore. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling, but the rhythm was too precise, too consistent. I crept to the bottom of the stairs and peered up, my heart pounding. The hallway was a dark, silent void. Nothing was there. I went back to the living room, and a few minutes later, the sound started again, this time from a different part of the upstairs. Thump, thud, thump. It was moving through the house, a slow, methodical progression. The second thing happened an hour later. I was still on the couch, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, when I heard a new sound. It was coming from the kitchen, just off the living room. A soft, wet, scraping sound, as if something was dragging itself along the linoleum floor. It was a slow, deliberate sound, punctuated by a faint, wet hissing that was too close for comfort. I knew I couldn't just sit there. The sounds were no longer just a vague fear. They were a living, breathing presence in the house. The terror peaked when the sounds from the upstairs and the downstairs converged. The rhythmic thudding from the upstairs stopped. The wet, hissing sound from the kitchen stopped. All was silent, save for the muffled tick of the clock. A minute passed. Then I heard it. A single, wet thud from the hallway just outside the living room door. A small sound, but it was too close to final. It was followed by that familiar, high-pitched scraping on the front door. But it wasn't a single sound now. It was a long, scraping sound that seemed to go on forever, from the top of the door to the bottom. And then, the door handle, an old, heavy brass knob, slowly began to turn. It rotated silently, with a deliberate, gentle pressure that was bone-chilling. The door was locked, but the handle continued to turn, slowly, as if the thing on the other side was simply testing its strength, in no hurry at all. Then I heard it speak. The voice was a low, sibilant whisper that seemed to emanate not from a throat, but from the wood of the door itself. It was wet, like a soft hissing intake of breath. It said my name, Josh. It was not a question, it was a statement, a confirmation. It had moved through the whole house, and now it was at my door. The climax was the moment the door began to open. I was in the living room, frozen with fear, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The door handle, which had been turning so slowly, suddenly stopped. A single, wet, sloshing sound came from the hallway, just outside the living room door. The door slowly opened, and a long, impossibly thin figure, a vague silhouette against the darkness, stood in the doorway. It moved with an unnatural, loping gait, its limbs bent at impossible angles. Its head was tilted slightly, as if it was listening. I saw, in the faint light from the moon, that the floor behind it was wet, as if something had just emerged from a liquid. The figure raised a long, spindly arm and pointed a long, tapered finger at me. The whispering began again, a low, sibilant sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my mind. The voice was not speaking words. It was transmitting a flood of pure, conceptual information. It was asking me if I had been good, if I had behaved, if I had obeyed the rules of the house. It's a question, but it's not a question. It's a judgment. And I knew, with a primal certainty, that I was not being judged by a person, but by a thing that lives in the house's walls. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was a listening silence, a profound stillness, that was waiting for my answer. I fled. I didn't even stop to grab my phone. I ran to the nearest window, smashed it with a chair, and burst out into the blackness of the yard. I ran until I hit the main road, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was found by a passing motorist, and no one believed my story. The house was later found to be completely normal. All doors locked, all systems working perfectly. I never told anyone what happened. I never house sat again. But every time I'm in a dark room, every time the darkness feels a little too deep, I can still hear a faint, wet, sibilant whisper in the back of my mind, and I know that the things that live in the darkness aren't just shadows. There's something with a name and a plan, and they're waiting for you to be alone. The absence of a rational explanation is the final horror. The knowledge that there are things in this world that operate outside the bounds of human understanding, and that my brief encounter with one of them has left a permanent scar on my psyche. I am forever changed, forever haunted by the memory of a sound that shouldn't exist, and a presence that was not after me. But after the time I thought I had,